Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live broadcast. I'm Steve Altishan, Director of Client Partnerships here at Pacific Cascade Legal. Today, I'm here with Dr. Leslie Holthoff to talk about teaching your child about the birds and the bees. So, Leslie, before we start, can you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm the author of the book Not Mary, Not Row, which talks about sort of the lack of sex education that a lot of kids are getting, and even what they're getting in school, what it covers, what it doesn't. And so I am sort of a product of what not to do, some would say. I learned about the birds and the bees the wrong way. So our goal would be to make sure that it's actually talked about beforehand.
I love that. I love that. Me too, back in the day, I don't believe I got the birds and the bees talk from my parents. And, when our kids were young and this subject sort of came up, my first reaction was, "Oh, do we really need to talk about this?" Um, and so, yeah, I can see where that's interesting because it's embarrassing for the parents. And I'm wondering, do you still see this? I mean, this is now years later, but do you still see this sort of reaction in parents?
I feel like it's a lot better. I think that, my parents, I was basically brought up in the 80s, and I think that they were taught, like, basically, don't tell them anything. Like, my parents were so good at pretending that it didn't exist, or at least to me, that by the time I found out sort of what sex was, I only learned about it using, from slang words and kids at school and trying to figure out what they were talking about in songs they were playing on the radio. Um, and it was just something they didn't talk about because my parents were sort of like, you're not going to do that anyways until you're married. So, I mean, maybe they had some plan to talk to me the night before my wedding. I don't know. um, but that, that just clearly did not work. Now, a lot of my friends who have younger kids currently are doing a much better job than that. And I can tell that they're starting to talk about things, and we have conversations a lot on how to approach that and how to not do that. Like, for me, by the time I found out what it was, I felt lied to, right? Because it felt like my tiny little universe. I couldn't believe this was a thing that I had never heard of, that I got no warning about, that I just was completely taken by surprise. And so I do think, I mean, and honestly, obviously with the internet, there's just so much more access for kids. You've got to be more careful now. But whatever the reason is, I do think we're doing a better job. But it's still really hard as a parent because it requires you to think of your child as an adult, sort of. You take this very adult
Yeah.
thing, even though a lot of us, obviously, we were all at some point these kids, and we know what you're thinking about and what you're feeling. And, we forget all that, right? Adult amnesia. You just completely forget what it was like to be a child. And you're like, honestly, I couldn't have been doing at 13 what they're doing at 13. But yeah, you were.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you really do stress that, you know, don't wait to do it, do it before someone else does it. And but why, that that's got to be important to do that, to be the ones to do it, I guess you should say.
It is. And, it's also obviously it depends on the age of the child, but you can start immediately. And what I mean by that is you don't sit down with your 4-year old and, have some talk about sex per se, but you can, like if you're, say, in a meaningful married relationship or living together, you can still make sure that your child understands that there is something special that you and your partner do, like, oh, you can at least make it so that one day when they find out, they'll be like, oh, okay. You don't want them to feel like this is the craziest thing on the planet that they've ever heard of. I know of someone, and she would say, whenever she and her husband were talking about, sex in front of their kids, which would be very light, obviously, but it could be something like, oh, daddy and I are, we're gonna talk about some loving tonight, or just something simple like that. But it's the kids know that it's something between their parents, private. They know they don't know all the details, but they at least know that there's something there, long before they know exactly what's going on.
And you touched on it a little bit. it's never too early to start talking.
I don't
And
think so. I really don't.
yeah,
And you know, something that's crazy to think about is obviously the age of girls going through puberty just keeps happening earlier and earlier. And for it to be happening to 8 and 9 year olds is actually not unheard of. It seems unheard of to be talking to 8 and 9 year olds about anything having to do with having sex. But the fact is it's really difficult to explain to girls why this is happening and not explain to them the whole reason why, and for boys to hear about girls in their class or and them not have any understanding. So again, it's not necessary at that age to go into a million details, but
right,
it is
right,
absolutely essential that you've had some sort of a conversation before that and moving into that. And also, if you're not comfortable talking to them at 8, it's really not going to be any easier the older that they get.
yeah,
It's going to be a challenging conversation all the way through, but if you're having some conversations when they're younger, then it does make it easier to build on those conversations as they get older.
yeah. So conversations. It's another kind of an odd question, but I think back again to my younger self that moms talk to the daughters and dads talk to the sons, but you know is that really necessarily the way it should be, or should both sit down and talk, or how does that work?
So I think both, but I do know it depends on what it is, right? So it seems like moms are the ones who tend to be more comfortable talking to both kids, right? The son and the daughter. But I know that like girls are mortified often to have conversations about puberty with their dad. But I also think not having any of those conversations with a man figure, a father figure, is also a mistake. I mean, again, you don't have to talk about the details. It's about building the relationship with your child that says, I know this is kind of weird, but we have to talk about it. And that's something else that kind of leads me to my point of also the word sex. Man, it's great to use real terms, but it is okay if you sit down with your kid and you say, hey, I want to sit down and talk to you about sex, but that word is just kind of, because at this point your child may actually start throwing up, right? So
Yeah,
it's okay if you say, let's come up with a word that's just between you and me. And that word can be anything. It can be potato, it can be sandwiches. It doesn't have to be food. But you can use whatever word, and I think you'd be surprised how much easier that makes it for kids to talk to you, even if you're comfortable saying the real vocabulary. Um, it's good that your child know that vocabulary, of course, but it still is it. I don't want to say it makes it a game, but it just does. If you can say, hey, mom, you remember the other day when we were talking about sandwiches, and it's kind of funny and it takes the edge off, but like you're talking
yeah,
about something, but also it gives you a little bit of freedom. And these days when you're texting, or if you were at a party, that your child was at a party and something came up, they've got this other verbiage, that they don't have
right.
to worry about kids looking over their shoulder, or, oh my God, she's talking to her mom about sex, like you don't have to, it just gives it this little just extra something for you to be able to have between the two of you and to sort of build that relationship and build that trust. And if it makes them that much more comfortable coming to you, then all the better.
Yeah, yeah. So you had kind of talked a little bit before and about not necessarily throwing everything out at once.
Sure.
So how do you start? I mean, where do you start with, and what sort of information do you start giving before you start building up on that?
I think you start with the very famous "Where do babies come from?" Right? Like
Yep.
that seems to be where, if you're even of the age where you still know people, right, who are having kids, then you have to answer this question anyway. Sort of, so and so is pregnant. How? Why? It raises a lot of questions. And so that's sort of your first opportunity to get in there and be honest. And I think we used to do the, oh well, she swallowed a watermelon, or there's just these things are completely unhelpful. And I think what's important at that point isn't necessarily an anatomy conversation, but at that point it's a, a man and a woman, or whatever the relationship may be. it's two, two adults, or there's obviously a million different ways relationships can look like, but it needs to be just expressed that it was a decision, and it was something that, especially if you know both people, like they decided this together. And so you're starting to think about how relationships form and how decisions are made in healthy relationships, even if it's, you're beginning to show how even conversations happen and how they start. And so when you show that it's something that somebody decided to do together, and of course you can have single parents, but you should still at that point talk about how at some point this was a decision that was made between two people. And I think that if you start talking about the overall relationship and how it was two people who decided, you're already setting those boundaries, and you're already getting their minds thinking that this is not something that they're going to, as a female, spontaneously wake up one day and find happen to them, right? And it also teaches them some that they have some control over it, that it will be something that they will get to decide to do, and that it will be something that they can decide in their relationship in the future. And you've started all of that where it's easy to build on. And I think that's what's important, is that whatever you tell them on kind of step one, you can build on that. And it may be a couple of years before it comes up again, but then you can sort of reference back to what you already said and say, oh, well, something that we didn't go into back then was whatever you go to next. And I think that that really helps, build that trust too, because you are just continuing to say, I told you the truth. Now I'm telling you more, but
Yeah,
you didn't lie.
yeah. But and telling the truth and getting them to trust you makes them more open to coming to
That's
you. But that kind of leads to a question that I wonder what, because I think a few people I've kind of talked to getting ready for this was like, what if they come to me and I'm not ready? Or they ask a question. It's like you want to be proactive, but also have to be reactive, because if someone comes and asks you a question that's maybe not ready yet, what do you do?
I mean, I think it's okay to say, hey, because a lot of times, say this question comes up while you're in the car on the way to school, or you're on the way to ballet practice or something, right? I think it's okay to say, hey, there's actually a lot of things I would really like to talk to you about in reference to this, but I would appreciate it if we could wait until we had more time to sit down. And then if you say, in between, that response and when you sit down, then you kind of have a chance to sort of put some thoughts on paper, or think about it, or talk to somebody, or whatever you feel like you need to do as the adult to figure out how to respond to it. I think the most important thing is to say, however you say it, I'm glad that you came to me. I respect this question. I want to answer it for you, but there's a lot to talk, you know what I mean? And if you're going to push the conversation, that's fine, but you want to make sure that they don't feel blown off, that they don't feel
Yeah,
like you're dodging the question. And if you say, can we talk about it on Sunday? You have to really talk about it on Sunday.
yeah,
It was so difficult for that child to come to you the first time. Don't make them be the one who comes back to you on Sunday and says, you told me we were going to talk about it on Sunday. Like, you need to take the initiative. They already
yeah.
did once. You take the initiative. Make sure that what you say is true, because that, of course, builds that bond and that trust. But just so important to follow through with stuff like that. But definitely okay to buy yourself some time.
I like that. It's funny when I got again ready to make this. I Googled birds of the bees, and there's so many different definitions for that. And one of them, and I just wanted to ask you about this. It's not just about sex. It's about your own body and understanding your own body, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, it is. And in line with what you were saying, like, so much has changed. Even as a woman who has sons, and even as a woman who used to be a little girl, when I was younger, even that kind of stuff was something that was very difficult for my parents to talk to me about. I think my mom avoided a lot of conversations about it, but she did give me like a book once, or more like a booklet, or something to learn. And of course, they were talking about it in school. And I think the crossover here to these things is, it's easy for the schools to tell you, you know, the facts about it, right? Like, here's the real words for this anatomy. Here's,
Yeah,
but what the schools can't do, and what I think that we want to do as parents, both discussing the changes in your body and sex, is that we want to make sure that they understand the practical application of that. And what do I mean by that? I mean, for example, just like I talked about earlier, my parents took the stance of, you abstain until you're married. So there's nothing to talk about, especially while you're young and you're a teenager or whatever. But what no one ever explained to me, and certainly not what you know, I heard about what sex was, and I heard about what abstinence was, but nobody talked to me about that gray in the middle, and nobody talked
Yeah.
about how sex gets started, right? Because once you're actually having sex, there's actually quite a few things that lead up to that.
Yeah.
And nobody told me what those were. And so I found myself as a young girl not even knowing that I was putting myself in a situation where sex was going to be on the table, or you know what I mean, was
Yeah.
expected of me, because I had no idea that him putting his hand on my knee could initiate that eventually, or that, you can kiss and you can walk away from kissing, but there's all this stuff in the middle. And I think that that's what they don't teach you in school. And that's what I think is so hard. And then also, I was sort of always taught, I wasn't taught anything about sex, right? But it seemed like something that, why would you ever want to do that until you were married? So, and it was just like, no one also told me that as a teenager with all these, you're going to want to. You're even though I'm your parents, I'm telling you not to, or your church or your leader or wherever their teacher, wherever they're learning this from, they don't tell you how bad you're going to want to, and they don't tell you how difficult it's going to be to say no, and they don't tell you that it's just that in between. To me, the gray area that we just don't spend enough time talking about is, what are all of the sexual aspects of physical contact that happens before sex.
Oh my God, you took me right back to my, I don't know, junior high, when literally the sex talk for boys was, a baseball term,
Yeah.
and I still don't know what second base is. So, and,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
no one's no. I love that you actually kind of get into this, and if this happens, this may happen, and so these things you got to be aware of. I love that. I love that, and it kind of leads to that. Another thing that you really wanted to talk about was, and you said, I really like the term, it, be completely open and honest, and that can be hard.
It's so hard because, again, you are taking something that as an adult you think of an adult act, and it's really hard to remember what it was like for you. And you're having a conversation with a kid, and it is hard, but it is also absolutely imperative to remember that these kids are 100%, they're gonna find out about it, like, without question, without doubt. The only thing that you have the tiniest bit of control over, and I would argue that you even have that, is when.
Yeah,
And again, I was singing Madonna. I mean, what did she mean when she said like a virgin, or Papa don't preach, and I was just like, what does this mean? And I remember not understanding. And the exact same thing is happening today, maybe not with Madonna music anymore, but they're still hearing things. And when they don't, it's human nature, right? To hear some term in a song or hear them talking about something, to be like, what are they talking about? And now you're kind of, it's in your mind. So now you're listening out for it to show up other places, and you're trying to define it for yourself, and you're trying to figure it out. And I mean, my God, they play music in the grocery store. Like, it's unavoidable that they're going to hear things and not know what it means. And so the most important thing is that you are someone they can talk to. And if you absolutely are uncomfortable being that person, and you are like, I cannot do it, I cannot have this conversation with my 10-year-old, or whatever that is, I think it is okay to sort of pass the buck. Maybe it's your child's aunt or uncle. My sister, I've told her, I said, hey, when your kids get old enough, I don't have a problem talking about these things. If you do, you just tell me, right? So as long as
yeah,
you're passing that buck to another adult that you trust, because sometimes once you get past that initial conversation, you're like, okay, I didn't have to tell them about all that, but now that they know, I can, you feel a little bit more comfortable. I mean, and that's okay too. The important part is that you give them a safe space, a safe person or persons, that they feel like they can talk to and go to with these questions. And I think that we have to do that. We have to do that, because what happens if you don't do that is all your worst nightmare.
yeah. Yeah. And like you said, for people who freeze up or like, oh God, um, I know it. I mean, I'm guessing it's not right to say here, read this, but are there resources and books that are like, for a 5 year old and an 8 year old and my 34-year old?
Yes, I don't know any of those offhand, but I do know that there are quite a few children's books designed to help with these conversations. Um, and I know it sounds crazy, but there's also books that sort of talk about reproducing, right, from chickens and from animals per se. And so it's okay to sort of start there and then start relating it. And I think that happens sort of on accident anyway, is that they learn in school, you know, how animals reproduce, and then
Right.
it's sort of just start connecting the dots. So there absolutely is a ton of resources out there. I mean, as you said, what you can just Google it these days and find it. And when my mom was having a hard time talking to me, she gave me that booklet, and thank God she did that, right? I mean, I think that's okay too. And she said, you can talk to me if you have any, read this and tell me if you have any questions. You know, I was the kind of person, even as a child, who was too embarrassed to ask, um, too embarrassed to not know, too embarrassed to admit I didn't know. And so, I think you have to kind of know your kids. And one thing that I did learn is that, having one kid that responds to one thing does not mean you'll have two kids that respond to the same thing. So I think sometimes it might take more than one thing. You may
Right.
be able to point them to a book, but also try to have a conversation, and who knows what will work, who knows what will get through to them. But you just have to keep trying until you feel satisfied that they know where to get the resources they need, and know who they can talk to, even if they choose not to.
And I'm assuming this is an ongoing adventure, which leads into when they're teenagers. And I mean, there's a whole other set of sort of things going on about, reproduction and rights on your body, and prevention, and who should be in charge of that. I don't does that is that still sort of that birds and bees, or is that just a whole other issue?
You know, you're so right. I think it
Yeah.
is all part of the same conversation. And obviously, the political climate, right? So, abortion's in the news, and that's
Yeah.
something that you have to talk about with your kids, whether they need to understand what it is. I have, like I said, I have boys, 22 and 30, and I have absolutely had conversations with them about what is abortion and what exactly it means. And not that they didn't have some knowledge of that, but I wanted them to have a lot of knowledge about that. I wanted to make sure that they thoroughly understood. And I think slash hope that I've done a good enough job of being open with them, that they know that they can come to me and ask those questions, and they have, and I love that. And even though there's no generation better at Googling than theirs, right? It isn't the same thing. And if you don't really know what you're looking for, or you don't really understand what the answer is, um, it can be difficult to understand. And so, even to your point, as adults, I'm still having these conversations, and neither one of my kids are married. And so I often have, because when you talk about sex, what you're really talking about is you're still talking about relationships, be it a very
Yeah.
short relationship or how it interacts in a long relationship. And as you well know, relationships constantly are changing, and they never stop. Um, and they're always evolving. And so I think that being a safe space is something that kind of goes on indefinitely.
Yeah. Oh, well, we're almost out of time, but I gotta ask, because
Because
one of the things you talked about is, and we may have already hit it, is there are topics when it comes to this, are often just not done and not. And you sent me something like, the number one thing you better make sure that you tell. So what
it
is
is
that?
what we've talked about. To me, it's what leads to sex. It is the
Yeah.
topics that we talked about. How do you get there? Because like as you said, there's first base and second base, and there's all of these things, especially that you experiment with before you get to sex. But it's really important that we make sure that kids know, but also girls, because I think it's really easy to find yourself in a situation where you just didn't. I mean, I know, again, this happened to me. I didn't understand the progression of things.
Yeah,
Um, and so I think it's really, again, it's important to talk about all of the things that the boys are going to want to do with their bodies to
yeah,
your body and vice versa. Because, I mean, oral sex is something that you have to talk about. And it was one of the first things that I heard about, and I didn't understand what it meant for way too long. But that's something else, like how often are we talking about that? I don't
yeah,
think that is making it into the conversations we're having about sex. I think that
yeah,
it's left out, and we are learning about that from rap songs, and
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah. Well, that's exactly what you said. And I really relate to what you said about going, you can Google, but that doesn't mean you're getting good information because we kind of preach, people who go out and want to do DIY divorces,
Mhm.
they go and Google what to do. And then it falls apart because there's some good information, but there's so much old, outdated, bad information. So I get that. I absolutely get that. Wow. We are running out of time. But before we do stop, I do want to ask you if someone wants to get a hold of you, how can they do that?
Sure. Thank you for asking. My website is Leslie Hope Coaching, Leslie Hope Coaching. And there's a contact form on there. And there's also links to my book. And you can kind of stay up to date with what I've got going on. I hope there'll be another book in the near future. But anyways, that's the best way to find me.
I love it. Well, thank you for being here. This
Yeah.
was a topic that I was excited about entering.
I know.
And you talked about it in a way that, even I can understand. And I only blushed twice. So that was pretty good. So thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Oh, it was great. And everyone else, thank you for joining us. If anyone has any further questions on today's topic, well, you can post it here and we can get you connected with Leslie, or you can contact her directly. So until next